A millionaire paid a homeless woman to have his child. When the baby was born, he fell to his knees, crying. What happened next will move you. But first, remember to subscribe to our channel so we can keep sharing incredible stories. The rain was relentless that night, pounding against the cracked pavement of Chicago's downtown streets. Maggie Davis huddled under a thin blanket near a bus stop, clutching a worn-out backpack that carried everything she owned. Life on the streets had been a cruel teacher, but it had also hardened her resolve. Each day was a fight for survival, and Maggie had learned not to trust anyone who claimed to offer help. That's why when Charles Sterling approached her with a proposition, she instinctively recoiled. Dressed in a tailored suit with a polished demeanor that screamed wealth, Charles was as out of place in this neighborhood as a diamond in a junkyard. He stood a few feet away, holding an umbrella against the rain, his blue eyes steady and his voice calm as he said, "I want to offer you a way out of this life." Maggie glared at him, clutching her blanket tighter. "I've heard that line before. Spare me the sermon." Charles remained unfazed. "I'm serious. I'll pay you. A substantial amount." "Pay me for what?" Maggie shot back, her tone sharper than she intended. "To have my child," Charles said plainly, his words cutting through the night like a cold gust of wind. Maggie stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or scream. "You're insane!" Charles stepped closer, but not enough to invade her space. "I'm not. I've thought this through. I'll give you a home, medical care, and enough money to start a new life when it's over. All I ask is that you carry my child." Her instincts screamed at her to run, but then her stomach growled, a painful reminder of the empty days and nights she'd endured. The promise of security, even temporarily, was tempting. Still, Maggie wasn't someone to jump at a dangling carrot without questioning the trap. "Why me?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. Charles hesitated, a flicker of something vulnerable crossing his face before he masked it. "Because I want this child to be born from someone who understands struggle. Someone strong." Maggie laughed bitterly. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Charles replied softly. "I've been watching. I don't mean that in a creepy way," he added quickly, seeing her expression shift. "I've seen how you've survived out here. You're resourceful, resilient, and honest. That's more than I can say for most people I know." Maggie shook her head, overwhelmed by the absurdity of the situation. Yet the weight of her current reality pressed down on her. "And what happens to me after this deal? What if I change my mind?" "You can walk away any time," Charles said without hesitation. "But the money, the house, the care, it's all yours, no matter what." Maggie's mind raced. This man, with his clean-shaven face and unflinching confidence, seemed to hold all the cards. But for the first time in years, she felt the faintest glimmer of control. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles nodded. "Take all the time you need. Here's my card. Call me when you're ready." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain-soaked night. Maggie stared at the card in her hand, the name Charles Sterling embossed in gold letters. It felt like a ticket to a new world. But at what cost? As the rain eased into a soft drizzle, Maggie leaned back against the wall, clutching the card tightly. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a deal. It was the beginning of something that would change her life forever. The walls of the Sterling estate were a stark contrast to the cold, unforgiving streets Maggie had called home. They rose high, adorned with intricate carvings, while sprawling gardens flanked the driveway. For someone used to the sharp chill of alleyways and the coarse fabric of charity blankets, the sheer luxury was almost suffocating. Maggie sat stiffly on the edge of a plush leather couch in the grand living room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. A fire crackled in the oversized fireplace, its warmth doing little to ease the unease curling in her stomach. Across from her, Charles sat with an effortless composure, sipping tea from an elegant porcelain cup. "This is where you'll stay," he said, gesturing around the room. "You'll have access to everything you need, nutritionists, doctors, anything to ensure a healthy pregnancy." Maggie hesitated, her voice small. "And what happens when the baby's born?" Charles set his cup down with precision. "Then you're free to leave. The money will be transferred to you as agreed. No strings attached." The words should have reassured her, but they didn't. Something about Charles was a puzzle she couldn't quite piece together. He wasn't cruel or condescending, yet there was a detachment in his tone that made her wary. Days turned into weeks, and Maggie adjusted to her new reality. Her room, larger than any space she'd ever occupied, was decorated in soft hues of cream and gold. She had clothes that fit, meals prepared by professional chefs, and the constant presence of staff who treated her with practiced politeness. But amidst all the comfort, an emptiness lingered. Maggie often found herself wandering the estate's sprawling grounds, seeking solitude. One afternoon, as she stood by the edge of a pristine koi pond, Charles approached. He was dressed casually, a departure from his usual suits, but his guarded demeanor remained. "You've been quiet," he observed, his tone neutral. Maggie shrugged. "What's there to say? I'm living in a palace while waiting to give birth to someone else's child." Charles's jaw tightened, and for a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps. "You're not just someone else, Maggie. You're important in this equation." Maggie turned to face him, crossing her arms. "Why are you doing this, Charles? And don't give me the strong and resilient speech again. I want the truth." He looked away, his gaze settling on the water. "I lost a child," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Years ago. It broke me in ways I didn't think possible." The revelation hit Maggie like a jolt. For the first time, she saw cracks in Charles's polished exterior. "So this is redemption?" she asked, her tone softer. Charles's expression was unreadable. "Maybe, or maybe I just wanted to believe I could start over without repeating my mistakes." The air between them grew heavy with unspoken emotions. Maggie wanted to ask more, but the rawness in Charles's voice made her hesitate. Over time, their dynamic began to shift. Charles started joining Maggie for meals, asking about her past. Initially reluctant, she shared bits and pieces: her mother's illness, the eviction that left her homeless, the countless nights spent avoiding danger on the streets. "You've been through so much," Charles said one evening, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "And yet here I am," Maggie replied with a wry smile, though there was no humor in her eyes. But just as a fragile sense of trust began to form between them, cracks in their arrangement began to show. Charles's family caught wind of the situation, and whispers of scandal began to circulate among his social circle. One night, during a tense dinner, Charles received a call that made his face pale. He excused himself abruptly, leaving Maggie alone at the table. She could hear his muffled voice from the next room, sharp and defensive. When he returned, his expression was stormy. "It seems not everyone approves of my decisions," he said, his words clipped. Maggie frowned. "Your family?" Charles nodded, pinching the bridge of his nose. "They think I've lost my mind, that I'm tarnishing the sterling name." "Maybe they're right," Maggie said, her voice steady. "I mean, this whole thing, how could anyone understand?" Charles looked at her, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through. "Do you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. That night, as Maggie lay in her bed, staring at the ornate ceiling, doubt gnawed at her. She had stepped into this arrangement to survive, to escape the endless cycle of poverty and despair. But now, she found herself tangled in something far more complicated than she had anticipated. The day Maggie went into labor was marked by an unsettling stillness. The typically busy Sterling estate had been reduced to whispers and hurried footsteps as the staff prepared for the impending arrival. Charles remained a constant presence, his normally stoic demeanor now tinged with a visible edge of anxiety. Maggie was wheeled into a private medical suite within the estate, her breathing sharp and uneven. Despite the state-of-the-art facilities and the soothing reassurances of the attending physician, fear clung to her like a second skin. She gripped Charles's hand tightly as another contraction tore through her. "You're doing great," Charles said, his voice low but steady. Maggie shot him a look, sweat glistening on her brow. "Don't patronize me, Sterling. This isn't a spa day." A faint smile tugged at Charles's lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. He stayed by her side, unwavering, as the hours dragged on. When the baby finally arrived, a boy with a piercing wail that filled the room, the air seemed to shift. The doctor wrapped the newborn in a soft blanket and handed him to Maggie. She stared down at the tiny face, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. A wave of emotion washed over her, relief, joy, and an inexplicable sense of protectiveness. Charles stood nearby, his hands clenched at his sides as he watched. When Maggie finally extended the child toward him, his knees buckled and he sank to the floor. "Charles." Maggie's voice was tinged with alarm, but he didn't respond. Tears streamed down his face as he reached out, his hands trembling, to cradle the baby. His polished facade crumbled, and the raw vulnerability of the moment left everyone in the room stunned. "I never thought I'd get another chance," Charles whispered, his voice breaking. Maggie exchanged a glance with the doctor, who discreetly stepped out, leaving the two alone. "What are you talking about?" Maggie asked, her tone gentle despite her confusion. Charles looked up at her, his blue eyes glistening. "My first child. Her name was Emily. She was only 5 when she—" He trailed off, his voice choking on the words. Maggie's breath caught. She had sensed there was more to Charles's proposal than he let on, but the depth of his pain was something she hadn't anticipated. "What happened to her?" she asked softly. Charles clutched the baby closer, as if the child were a lifeline. "It was an accident. A car crash. I was away on business. I should have been there, Maggie. I should have protected her." The weight of his confession hung heavy in the room. Maggie felt a pang of sympathy she hadn't expected. "So this is about her?" she asked. Charles shook his head vehemently. "No, this is about doing things right this time. About giving this child the love and protection I failed to give Emily." Maggie watched him, her own emotions in turmoil. She had agreed to this arrangement out of desperation, but now, holding the baby and seeing Charles's heartbreak, she realized she was part of something far more profound than a mere transaction. Days turned into weeks, and Maggie recovered from the birth under the care of the estate's staff. The baby, whom Charles named Henry, quickly became the center of attention. Charles was an attentive father, but his overprotectiveness sometimes bordered on obsessive. One evening, as Maggie sat by the nursery window watching Henry sleep, Charles joined her. "You're good with him," he remarked, his tone softer than usual. Maggie smiled faintly. "You're not so bad yourself. A little overbearing maybe, but not bad." Charles chuckled, though it lacked humor. "Can you blame me?" Maggie studied him for a moment. "No, but you can't let fear control you, Charles. Henry deserves more than that." Her words struck a chord, and Charles nodded slowly. "You're right, but it's hard to let go of the guilt." Maggie reached out, placing a hand on his. "You can't change the past. All you can do is be present now." Their eyes met, and for the first time, there was a mutual understanding. They were two broken people, trying to piece themselves together for the sake of an innocent life. But their fragile peace was shattered when news of Henry's birth leaked to the press. Tabloid headlines screamed about the eccentric billionaire and his homeless surrogate, sparking a media frenzy. Charles's family, already skeptical of his decisions, descended on the estate, demanding answers. "You've humiliated us," his sister Evelyn spat during a heated confrontation in the study. "Do you have any idea what people are saying about the Sterlings?" Charles, holding Henry protectively, faced her with steely resolve. "I don't care what they say. Henry is my son, and Maggie is part of this family now." Maggie, standing in the doorway, froze. The word family hit her like a jolt. She had spent years feeling invisible, and now, in this chaotic whirlwind, she had found something she never expected, a place where she belonged. The Sterling estate was no longer a sanctuary. Paparazzi camped outside the gates, their cameras flashing incessantly as they angled for a glimpse of the mysterious woman who had captured the headlines. Maggie could hear their shouts even from the confines of her room, each intrusion a stark reminder of how much her life had changed. Inside the house, tensions boiled over. Charles's family refused to relent, their voices ringing through the halls during tense meetings held behind closed doors. Maggie wasn't invited to these discussions, but the staff whispered enough for her to piece together the truth. Charles was under immense pressure to sever ties with her and assert his image as the sole guardian of the child. One night, as Maggie fed baby Henry in the nursery, Charles entered, his face lined with exhaustion. He closed the door and leaned against it, as though shielding the room from the chaos outside. "They want me to force you out," he admitted, his voice heavy. Maggie stiffened, her hands pausing mid-motion. "And what do you want, Charles?" He met her gaze, his blue eyes clouded with conflict. "I want what's best for Henry, and I don't think what's best is me giving in to their demands." Maggie sighed, her heart heavy with uncertainty. "I never wanted to complicate your life. I agreed to this because I needed a way out. But now, everything feels so much bigger than me." Charles stepped closer, lowering himself into a chair beside her. "Maggie, none of this is your fault. If anything, you've given me hope, something I didn't think I'd find again." His words, laced with sincerity, caught her off guard. For a moment, she saw past the wealthy facade to the man beneath, a man haunted by loss, yet desperate to protect the fragile happiness he had found. But not everyone in the Sterling household shared his sentiment. Evelyn, Charles's sister, was relentless in her campaign to rid the family of its newest addition. One afternoon, she cornered Maggie in the library, her sharp heels clicking against the marble floor like a metronome of judgment. "You must know this arrangement can't last," Evelyn said, her tone dripping with disdain. Maggie turned to face her, cradling Henry protectively. "I'm not here to cause problems. All I want is what's best for him." "What's best for him," Evelyn snapped, "is not a homeless woman playing house in my family's legacy." The words stung, but Maggie stood her ground. "Henry deserves love, not some cold, calculated upbringing dictated by appearances," Evelyn sneered. "Don't mistake Charles's pity for love. You're a means to an end, nothing more." The confrontation left Maggie reeling. She spent the night pacing her room, torn between staying to fight for the bond she was forming with Henry or leaving to spare Charles further scandal. Her decision came the next morning when she overheard a heated argument between Charles and his family. Evelyn's voice rang out, sharp and accusatory. "This entire mess is your fault. You dragged our name through the mud, and for what? A replacement for the daughter you lost?" Maggie's breath hitched. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed left her shaken. Before she could retreat, Charles stormed out of the study and caught sight of her. His expression softened, but she could see the weariness in his eyes. "I can't keep doing this," Maggie said, her voice trembling. Charles stepped closer, his presence a calming force. "Maggie, don't let them push you out. Henry needs you. I need you." Tears welled in her eyes. But what about what you need, Charles? You're tearing yourself apart trying to please everyone. Maybe this isn't fair to you either. He reached out, taking her hands in his. What's not fair is letting them dictate how I live my life. I lost my chance to fight for Emily. I won't lose this chance too. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of shattering glass from the foyer. Charles and Maggie rushed downstairs to find a brick lying amid shards of broken window pane, a crude note tied around it. "Keep the freak show away from our town." The sight of the vandalism sent a chill down Maggie's spine. Charles read the note aloud, his voice tight with anger. "This is what they've reduced us to," he said, crumpling the paper in his fist. "But I won't let fear win." That evening, Charles gathered the household staff and his family in the main hall. Maggie stood at the edge of the room, holding Henry as Charles addressed the group. "I've made my decision," he announced. "Henry stays, and so does Maggie. Anyone who has a problem with that is free to leave." Evelyn scoffed, but the determination in Charles's voice silenced any objections. After the gathering dispersed, Charles found Maggie in the nursery. He sat beside her, his expression weary but resolute. "They're going to fight me every step of the way," he said. Maggie looked at him, her own resolve hardening. "Then let them. We'll fight back together." For the first time in weeks, Charles smiled, a small but genuine expression of hope. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change for both Maggie and Charles. The Sterling estate, once shrouded in conflict and judgment, began to quiet as the family's resistance faltered. Evelyn, disheartened by Charles's unwavering resolve, left for Europe, taking her biting critiques with her. The paparazzi eventually lost interest, their attention diverted to fresher scandals, and the estate reclaimed some semblance of peace. Maggie, however, still wrestled with uncertainty. Despite Charles's public defense of her, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was an outsider in a life far removed from her own. Every morning, as she cradled Henry in her arms, she wondered if her place in his world would always feel temporary. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Charles called Maggie to the study. She hesitated before entering, clutching Henry close. The room, lined with books and adorned with antique furniture, felt imposing. Charles stood by the window, his silhouette framed by the fading light. "You wanted to see me?" Maggie asked, her voice cautious. Charles turned, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about everything. About Henry, about you, about the future." Maggie's grip on Henry tightened instinctively. "And?" Charles gestured for her to sit, then settled into the chair across from her. "When I first approached you, I thought I was offering you a chance. But somewhere along the way, I realized it was the other way around. You've given me hope, Maggie. You've shown me what it means to truly care for someone." Maggie blinked, her throat tightening with emotion. "I didn't do anything special, Charles. I just did what I thought was right." He shook his head. "You did more than that. You gave Henry a chance at a life filled with love and compassion. And you gave me the courage to confront my own failings." Maggie looked down at Henry, who had drifted off to sleep in her arms. "I did it for him. He's the only thing that matters." Charles leaned forward, his voice earnest. "Exactly. Which is why I want you to stay, not as someone who feels like an outsider, but as family. Henry deserves both of us, Maggie, together." The words hung in the air, their weight settling deep in Maggie's chest. She had spent so much of her life running from pain, from failure, from herself. But now, faced with Charles's unwavering sincerity, she felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: belonging. "Family," she murmured, testing the word on her tongue. Charles nodded. "Family." Maggie's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. I don't know how to do this, Charles. I've never had this. Neither have I, he admitted with a faint smile. But maybe we can figure it out together. Over the months that followed, they did just that. Maggie found herself slowly integrating into Charles's world, not as a guest or a burden, but as an equal partner in raising Henry. Charles, in turn, learned to let go of his guilt and embrace the joy of fatherhood. Together, they began to rebuild not only their own lives, but also the lives of others. Charles used his influence to establish a foundation in Henry's name, aimed at supporting single mothers and homeless families. Maggie, now a central figure in the organization, brought her first-hand experience and empathetic touch to its initiatives. The foundation quickly gained recognition, its impact spreading far beyond the confines of Chicago. Maggie, once invisible, found herself standing on stages, sharing her story to inspire others. Charles stood by her side, his pride evident in every glance he cast her way. On Henry's first birthday, the Sterling estate was transformed into a vibrant celebration. Friends, staff, and beneficiaries of the foundation gathered in the garden, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Maggie stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as Charles held Henry high, his laughter echoing across the grounds. "You look happy," a voice said beside her. Maggie turned to find Susan, the foundation's director of communications, smiling warmly. "I am," Maggie replied, her voice steady. "For the first time in a long time, I am." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the estate in a warm glow, Maggie felt a sense of peace she hadn't thought possible. The journey that had begun in the rain-soaked streets of Chicago had brought her to this moment, a moment filled with hope, love, and the promise of a brighter future. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid to embrace it.